Welcome, welcome, everybody. Looks like we've got everybody out of the waiting room as far as I can tell at this point, and it's 10 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Let me minimize my video so I can see what's going on. Okay. I'm Sarah O'Brien. I am a senior research associate here at UNC Highway Safety Research Center. And I've got Brian Massengill with me as well today. He's a sergeant with the City of Durham Police Department. And hopefully you're all here because you're interested in understanding more about crash data for bicyclist and pedestrian crashes, investigation and reporting of those crashes. We've got a few housekeeping items just to make sure everybody's on the same page as we go through with this Zoom. We do encourage you to share your camera if you're going to ask a question or just kind of want to engage more with the instructors. We love to see your faces, but please do mute yourself. We expect some more people to be coming online. If it stays this small of a group, feel free to just turn on your camera and ask questions and kind of interrupt us as we go. We're totally happy with having that. If for some reason it looks like it's getting a little unwieldy, we may ask you to hold your questions until we have some breaks where we can then go through people's questions and find out how to answer them efficiently. This session is going to be recorded, as you probably saw, and so it's going to be available for others to see after the fact. So if you've got somebody, a colleague, or somebody that you work with that you really think could benefit from seeing this information and they're not on the Zoom meeting today, Kristen Blank will be sending out information about where to get that recording once it's available, and we do encourage you to share that with others. If you do have problems with any audio or connectivity, there's a few things you can try. We do have a phone line that you can call into instead of using your computer audio. Of course, turning off your video camera can also save with the bandwidth, so sometimes that's all you need to do. And kind of last case resort, exit the Zoom and re-enter. That can reset some things. And if you do have some technical issues that can't be worked out with one of those solutions, feel free to send Kristen Blank a chat. You can just pull up her name directly with the chat box, and then any other questions you have for us as presenters or whatnot, feel free also to enter them into the chat if you feel more comfortable doing it that way. So if you've participated in some of the earlier modules, you'll remember that Watch for Me is a program that aims to reduce bicycle and pedestrian injuries and fatalities through a comprehensive targeted approach of public education, community engagement, and then leveraging specific law enforcement efforts. So the Watch for Me program, we have lots of opportunities to participate. If you haven't participated in any of the previous training modules, the recordings are available for the first 3 that were done, and you can see those listed there on your screen. Today is the 4th in a series of 5, so we will have one more coming up next month. As a reminder, if you're a law enforcement officer from your community and you're in a Watch for Me community, you are required to attend 3 out of the 5 trainings. And one of them has to be module 2, which is the laws and enforcement practices. And then you can select the other 2 that you would like to view. Okay, so benefits of these workshops, again, for law enforcement that are in a Watch for Me community, if you attend 3 of the modules, then you would be eligible, your law enforcement agency is eligible to get your reporting for Watch for Me related activities as part of the GHSP STEP, the portal, the statewide traffic enforcement program reporting system. You can report on your Watch for Me activities and earn credits there. And you'll also be eligible for receiving the Watch for Me education materials. And hopefully you're already aware of those. If not, feel free to reach out to me. I'm not going to spend additional time on that today, but you will learn more about those materials and how you can use them in the next module in September. So with that, let's get into this workshop topic. We're going to talk about how safety is measured. What do the crash trends tell us? How is it useful to look at the crash data? The importance of crash reports and really investigating and reporting accurately, timely, objective information. And then we'll also have time for questions and discussion, ideally as we go along, but definitely we'll have a couple of opportunities for breaks if you want to hold a question until then. As I mentioned, feel free to use the chat box. That does help us with being able to answer your questions as they come up. Again, doesn't look like we have a super large crowd today, so you're also welcome to raise your hand or just turn on your camera. That's a good cue that you have a question, and we'll try to answer your questions as they come up. Okay, so before we talk about crashes, we want to take a moment to consider the language that we use. And we'll talk more about this in Module 5 around communications. But you'll notice that as we go through today, and in general, when I'm talking about traffic incidents, I use the word crash instead of accident. And the reason is that accident implies that there are people that are just simply unlucky, or there was a random twist of fate and it's no one's fault. But traffic fatalities and injuries that result from crashes are preventable, and crashes themselves are predictable. We can see patterns when we start to look at those crash trends. And so crashes are the result of choices that people are making while they're navigating the streets, or, like, are they driving intoxicated? Do they choose to take into account the weather or not? Do they drive more slowly or allow more stopping distance if it's raining? But also, those choices could be made further back in the system. So think about the manufacturer of the vehicle. Maybe we see recalls for equipment all the time. There could be some malfunction with the vehicle. It could be based on policies and practices that are embedded in our transportation system that create the unsafe environments, which then influences the decisions that people make when they're traveling, and so on. So all of these things are things that we can start to understand by looking at the crashes and seeing those patterns and trends. And that's why it's important to get that data. So what makes us safer? Well, bicyclist and pedestrian crashes and the resultant outcomes of severe or fatal injuries typically arise because there's a complex set of factors, right? It's usually not just one thing. So, you think about where the roadway and the vehicle environment, the weather, road user behaviors, other issues are all combining to produce that life-threatening event. And while crashes can be complex, it's not necessarily you don't necessarily have to understand all the factors involved in every crash in order to prevent future ones. So really what we want to do is we want to focus on eliminating or minimizing the population-wide exposure to crash risks. So we think about designing roads that physically separate the driving areas from the walking areas. Things like that, to address systemic inequities, rather than focusing on the individual protective measures. You'll see that down at the very bottom of the pyramid. So when we talk about telling people to wear retroreflective clothing or things like that, those types of individual measures have been shown to be the least effective in preventing injuries and fatalities, and really thinking about that larger scale issue, higher order issue on the pyramid. Those are the things that are going to be the most effective population wide in preventing injuries and fatalities. And we do have some links that we can share with you along the way. One of those is a PBIC publication called Towards a Shared Understanding of Pedestrian Safety. And that's a really helpful document that allows you to take a deeper dive into thinking about those systemic factors. Kristen, will you be able to share links as we go along? That would
sure.
help me
Yes.
to know. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay, cool.
I am
Thanks.
able to do that, Sarah. Just say the word.
Awesome. So when we think about the road safety environment, it's also important to understand that a number of crashes in the crash data are only representing the tip of the iceberg, and they might not tell the whole story. And so this is really important when we think about bicycle and pedestrian crashes, because they happen so infrequently in any given year and in any given community, that if you just looked at the crash data alone, it might be misleading. And so crash data also don't include things like near misses or unreported injuries that might be self-treated or just risky behavior. And so we'll talk more in a little bit about reported crashes and what's the threshold to report a crash. But just keep in mind that those reported crashes are only showing a tiny portion of what might be impacting or exhibiting a safe or unsafe bicycle or pedestrian location or activity. So let's start with thinking about how can we measure safety using the crash data. So we analyze crash data to both identify the problems and to evaluate how well treatments are working. When you look at the data for your community, you'll likely need to include all the bike ped crashes rather than just fatalities like you might do for motor vehicle crashes. And that's again because those numbers of fatalities are so small that they'll fluctuate so widely, they're so variable over any given year. You'll also need to pull in probably at least 5 years worth of data to be able to really observe what trends are happening and try to sort out patterns. And at that big picture level, agencies can benchmark their numbers and see how the trends are changing over time. You can also use that maybe to compare yourself to your peers, things like that. At a more granular level, crash data can help you to identify specific locations like hotspots that might need improvement, or you can look at what maybe are the common types of crashes occurring and what are the major contributing factors. And then those can be matched with the evidence-based countermeasures that we're aware of to try to mitigate and address those particular issues that you can identify through the data. High quality safety analysis does demand high quality data. And unfortunately, oftentimes what we find is that there's poor data available or low quality data available. And that can actually limit the type of analyses that can be conducted. So it's also useful to think about the different metrics that can be used to express how safe or not your community is for pedestrians or bicyclists. And we think about several different ways to measure this that can help you determine that progress over time. So crash frequency is the count. It's like a straight number of crashes within a period of time, like within a year. When we calculate a crash rate, we're talking about the number of crashes per amount of traffic, for example. And that can be a more accurate measure for safety because it allows you to compare with sites that have similar characteristics. So think about, if you knew how many people were walking or biking each year within your community or on a particular segment of road, and both the number of people walking and biking increased and the number of crashes increased annually, then the crash rate from year to year might actually stay flat. It might show that you're not getting any more dangerous or less dangerous, even though the number of crashes increased. So that's why it's helpful to think about a crash rate. And then a crash outcome is a measure of the injury severity of the crash. So again, if the goal is to reduce fatalities and severe injuries, you might see raw numbers of crashes going up, but maybe they're in a lower severity type of injury. So a good example of that to think about is with roundabouts. Hopefully some of you have roundabouts in your communities. I'm curious if anybody wants to jump off of mute and maybe turn on your camera. Do you think that roundabouts are more or less safe than a conventional intersection, a four-way intersection? What do you think has is a safer intersection.
This is Keith from Charlotte. Definitely a roundabout, I would say. We had one just recently installed in our neighborhood down the street from us. And as a cyclist, I feel much safer at that intersection. It was kind of a convoluted, 5 different streets coming together. And traffic just flows so much better now as a result.
Okay, great. Have you looked at the crash data, or maybe it's too new to look at that, but do you have a sense of if the roundabout has more crashes or more severe crashes?
Too soon to tell. Yeah, it just opened a couple of months ago, so we haven't had enough time to do a proper crash data analysis. But I'll be curious to see, a year from now to compare what it looked like previously.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Keith. Anybody else have thoughts about roundabouts versus conventional intersections? Okay, so what the data has shown us in research that's been done comparing roundabouts with conventional intersections is that the number of severe crashes goes down. So you might actually see, sometimes you might actually see the overall number of crashes go up. But those types of crashes that it's mitigating are, kind of like the T-bone type crashes, the more severe crash types are going down. You might have more rear end crashes, but those are going to result in less severe outcomes. And so that's why, again, that's just an example of thinking about when we measure safety, just looking at the straight numbers sometimes doesn't tell you the whole picture, and it's good to look at different ways to measure safety. So we also need to recognize that the absence of a crash, looking at your data and saying, oh, we didn't have any crashes in a given area, that doesn't necessarily mean that that location is safe, right? So people aren't going to want to walk and bike if they have a perception that that location, that road, that particular intersection is unsafe. And so sometimes not having any crash data there can actually mean that it's a really dangerous location. So you need to think about that. Think about where you might have barriers to walking or biking in certain locations that could result in that inability for access, for them to reach essential needs, by foot or on a bicycle. And using the crash data alone is again, I've mentioned this, it's not going to tell you the full picture. It also leaves decision makers with a purely reactive kind of approach. You're looking at things that are happening after the fact and then trying to go back to fix them or identify locations where crashes have already happened. So it's retroactive, or it's reactive. And here's an example where we see that there's a poor design that's actually influencing the safety of bicyclists along the shoulder of this road. You can't see all the way further back, but it's a multi-line higher speed facility that kind of curves off back towards the right. And there's a shared use path that comes in and crosses the road at a skew. And there's a railroad track right there that goes along the road as well. And that's really setting up cyclists who are attempting to go across the railroad tracks. They're going not perpendicular, and that means they're more likely to snag that wheel in the flange gap, which can be a really nasty fall. And actually it's causing them to fall essentially into the street. And this is the type of crash that's actually never going to show up on an NCDMV 349 report because it doesn't involve a motor vehicle. So that's just one example. If an agency waits for crashes to happen, specifically crashes that show up on crash reports, to determine where your hotspots are, you might be missing some of these unreported locations, because they don't involve a car, or there's something else going on that you might be missing an opportunity to mitigate a situation through design or even maintenance. So we think back to the earlier modules where we talked about other data sources that can complement crash data, like hospital records, complaint records, incident reports. There's other data out there that you might want to use when you're measuring safety to help round out your understanding of what's happening and where bicyclists and pedestrians may be unsafe. So I don't expect you to read everything on this chart here. It's the graphic is really just to show and outline that there's a lot of shared responsibilities that are happening across all transportation professionals, road users, you know, and the idea is we want to mitigate the likelihood and frequency of crashes. And we have to use all the tools and knowledge and technology that's available. And so many other data sets can be used along with the police crash data, and that's going to give us greater safety insights. So we're just going to touch on a few of these as we go through, but I just want to show you the list on the left is a bunch of different individual data sources or resources that are available, and they kind of fall into these buckets or categories of pre-crash data, environment data, the actual crash data, the police reported data, which is what we're focusing on today, and then post-crash data. And all of those things can really come together to give you a more comprehensive picture of what's happening in your community. Okay, so one of these other data sources that's mentioned in that previous slide are the hospital records. And hospital records are often the only source of information for bicycle and pedestrian crashes that are not recorded by the police. So sometimes that's because they're not eligible, they don't meet the threshold to be reported by the police, like a person who might trip or fall, that, you know, when they're just walking along a sidewalk that's been poorly maintained. And then injury surveillance systems are, they typically provide data on the EMS services, hospital emergency departments, hospital admissions and discharges, trauma registry, and then that long-term rehab that might be happening. So that information can be used to track the injury causes, the severity, the costs, and the outcomes. And sometimes, you know, an injury that's associated with a traffic crash is only going to get like one type of injury in these medical systems. And these injury types, when you're going through, can be a useful source of data to help bridge that gap between the traditional traffic safety data and the public health issues. So hospital data can also be used to identify the full magnitude of crashes for a specific user group or demographic, because we also know that sometimes even if a crash could be reported through a DMV 349 form, not everybody is comfortable with going to the law enforcement and engaging and actually having a report written up. And so the hospital data can also help with that understanding of the true bicycle crash numbers or pedestrian crash numbers. Surrogate data is another kind of way to measure safety. And it's basically recognizing that not all the actions that are potentially risky behaviors, you know, result in a crash. And so sometimes we can look at specific types of behaviors or maneuvers or crash avoidance movements, which can also be predictive of the likelihood of a crash. And so that's really helpful when you're, again, looking at where do you have problematic locations. It may not be necessarily showing you that in the data with outcomes of crashes or the patterns, the frequency may not be high enough, you know, statistically to show you that there's issues there. But if you start looking at some of the surrogates, you can then see like, oh gosh, a lot of people are, you know, maybe we're seeing a lot of swerving in this location, or a lot of people who are changing their speed suddenly or their trajectory or path. And so we know that that's potential for an outcome, a likelihood of a crash to occur. And that can help you to intervene maybe before, or, you know, do some sort of countermeasure treatment there before you really have crashes go up. So conflicts are one of those types. And I just mentioned basically an example of that, where maybe you have a sudden change in speed or the trajectory and path of the traveler. This could be the bicyclist, the pedestrian, or the driver. Might be shown by audible warnings, so like yelling or horn blowing, things like that. Anything that people are doing to avoid a collision. These types of data have to be collected in person with in-person observation or through video footage that then gets coded. Near misses is another example of surrogate data that can sometimes be captured via video as well. Most of the time, what we see with the research of near misses is it's actually self-reported data. So people, maybe there's like a crowdsourced website where people can then go and they click on a place on a map and they self-report, you know, oh, I almost got hit by a driver in this location or something like that. So that's another type of data that can be used. And then observing behaviors. So oftentimes I've been involved in a lot of research where we're looking at pedestrian safety, and we're doing that, we're measuring that by observing the yielding rates of motorists at a particular location, like for example, a crosswalk. We can also look at reductions in speed on approach to a crosswalk. So that's another kind of proxy way to think about measuring safety. For pedestrians, we can also look at, you know, what are they doing before they're crossing? What are their looking behaviors? Are they looking left, right, left? Are they using the actual crosswalks, or are they crossing at a mid-block location that's not marked? Are they complying with traffic signals? Things like that. And then for bicyclist studies, we can also look at yielding behaviors there. We can look at how bicyclists are merging or mixing with motor vehicles in certain locations, or just generally looking at how motorists and bicyclists are interacting with one another. And then user perceptions is another way that we can measure safety. And again, this is typically a self-report style of measuring or providing that information. So you might have a focus group or something like that, and people are relaying to you how comfortable they feel, how safe they feel, where are they walking, things like that. And so you can set up some performance measures around the safety ratings for particular roadways based on user perceptions. So we know that single sources of data don't give a complete picture. And we also know that data sets, an individual data set, is going to have its own challenges that might distort that story. And so when we think about crash data in particular, those types of challenges can be, you know, maybe changes in how an officer codes a crash, or changes in reporting thresholds. These types of things can result in the changes in apparent numbers of crashes over time, because they're getting measured slightly differently from year to year. There could be shortcomings in the crash reporting forms based on like how the data was collected. So maybe too many or too few codes were included, or the inaccuracy of which codes were used. You might even see contradictory information across different variables on the form, or maybe with what the narrative says compared to what checkboxes were checked. So, you know, consistencies in crash data really relies on that officer understanding the laws, understanding who has right of way in particular situations with respect to bicyclists and pedestrians and that motor vehicle traffic. And then there can also be problems. We've seen this with the spatial data, because either the officers or witnesses might not be able to precisely describe the location of the crash. This is really important. It may not seem as important for motor vehicle crashes, but when you have a bicyclist or pedestrian, you know, 50 to 100 feet of pinpointing where that crash occurs can really influence what that data tells us on the outcomes, on the output side. You know, if a crash doesn't happen at an intersection, don't check that it was at the intersection. You know, it could have been a driveway 20 feet down or 30 feet down that somehow contributed to the crash. And if you code it as at the intersection, when people go back and look at that, they might not understand, oh, it's actually a problem with something in the environment, several feet away. So it's really important that the spatial data be accurate. And then another just huge missing piece of data, particularly when we think about trying to do crash rates, is not knowing the volume data, not knowing how many people are actually exposed to that risk of a crash, who's actually walking and biking in that area. And so that means we can't calculate that rate. And so we don't really have an equivalent of, crashes per vehicle miles driven or crashes per average daily traffic for bicyclists and pedestrians yet. Now, I will say that NCDOT has a count program that they've been operating for many years now, and a lot of local agencies are starting to collect their own bicycle and pedestrian counts, but there's still a really long way to go to have this be kind of at the level that we have for motor vehicles. So if that's something your community is interested in learning more about, please let me know, reach out to me, and I can give you some resources specifically on how to set up a count program. Okay, so now let's look at some of the bicyclist and pedestrian crash trends that we know of based on the data that's previously been collected. So I want to focus on pedestrians first, because that crash data is showing some really disconcerting trends. So this graph is for the US, and it's comparing people outside a motor vehicle to people that are inside a motor vehicle. So you can see that the inside, the occupants being injured in crashes or fatalities in this case, has been declining. And but unfortunately, people outside of the vehicle, so this includes motorcyclists and bicyclists as well as pedestrians, that trend has been going up, and it actually continues to go up for the next 2 years of FARS data. I just haven't updated this graph to show that. And really what's driving these fatality increases is the pedestrian fatalities. According to the FARS data, it increased by 53% from 2009 to 2018, while other traffic deaths only increased by 2%. So this is a really disconcerting trend because the proportion of fatalities that are happening to pedestrians. And we do see those similar trends when we look at the bicyclist and crashes, pedestrian crashes in North Carolina. I don't know how many of you, if you maybe can just use the raise hand button, have used the or the thumbs up, have used the North Carolina pedestrian bicycle crash data tool, or even know what I'm talking about. If you've seen that before, maybe do a thumbs up or something like that. Are people able to use? I might be talking about a control that you don't have action. Do you guys see reactions? Are you able to do reactions on your menu, on your Zoom menu? Like, I think I just did a thumbs up, but I don't know if it showed for everybody else. I see a thumbs up. Okay, Caitlin did a thumbs up. Some people are figuring it out. So, okay, Caitlin might be the only person who knows. So that's really interesting. So this is a database of those police reported crashes specific to bicyclists and pedestrians. And it's really important for you guys to know about this and be aware that you can actually go and do your own queries for data in your town or community by going to this website. And it splits it by pedestrian data and bicycle data. So Kristen can drop a link in the chat for where to go to get to this NCPB-CAT tool. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we know based on that. So at that same website, you can find these summary reports for the state, and they compile really useful statistics on the crash facts, the summaries and crash trends, crash related factors. So thinking about where, when, who, conditions present, things like that. There's also a companion on the crash types. So there's crash facts and there's crash types reports. And they also provide additional information and insights on potential treatment targets. So this is really useful to maybe review and understand, because not all communities are going to have enough crash data individually to draw up those similar summary statistics in your area, possibly. And so if you can just kind of see what's happening on the statewide, that might help you think through like what's happening in your community. I'm just going to show a few examples of the data that officers collect at a crash and how those are used, why they're important to help agencies think about and walk through where they can improve traffic safety. So these are all going to be graphs that are shown in those crash facts summary reports, and this is just a sampling of what you can look at. So between 2010 and 2019, there were almost 30,000 crashes between pedestrians and motor vehicles that were reported. And you can see that the highest year in that 10-year period was in 2018. I don't think the data has been updated yet for 2020. There's typically a little bit of a lag in what's in the PBCAT data, but I suspect that trend is continuing in the upwards trajectory. So, and when you look at the first 5-year period versus the second 5-year period, there's been about a 14% increase in pedestrian crashes. And you'll also note that these bars are split into rural along the bottom, the lighter blue color, and then urban. So one thing you can kind of eyeball is that the rural crashes have stayed relatively flat. And it's really the urban crashes where we're seeing the increase in pedestrian crashes. And about 75% of the crashes are happening in those areas. That makes sense, right? Because urban areas are more densely populated. There's more people that would be walking around. There's typically more pedestrian infrastructure for people to do that. And so the crash increase that we're seeing is really driven by an increase in these urban areas. So that's something to think about. So when we look at just the fatal and serious injury crashes now, you can see that there's a much sharper increase in these more severe outcomes. So not only are we having crash numbers go up, but the severity of the injury or the outcome is also going up. Part of that is based on a change in the definition of a type A injury that happened in 2016, where before they were defined as disabling injuries, and now they're included as any suspected serious injury. But that doesn't fully explain the increase because the number of fatals also have been increasing. And so one thing that's important to know here, we go back and look at that, the rural, again, remember, this is all pedestrian crashes rural, and that number is pretty flat. The trend is pretty flat. Then when we look at fatalities, we see that even in rural locations, the fatalities are increasing. And there's not too much difference now when we look at fatalities between urban and rural. And so what that's telling us is that on the whole, even though rural areas might have fewer ped crashes, there's a higher proportion of those crashes that are resulting in that more severe outcome. So that's problematic. All right, another way to look at crashes is, and the crash data is by the demographics of who's involved in these crashes. So this graph is specific to the coastal region of North Carolina. Again, if you go to the summary facts, you can find them for different regions as well. And we can see that Black people are disproportionately involved in crashes with motor vehicles. Black pedestrians are more involved in the crashes. And that's really the case actually across all of the 3 regions that North Carolina is split into. There's some variability across the regions for the other population demographics. So for example, in the coastal region, we see that the Native Americans are also highly represented in pedestrian crashes in this region. All right, so some samples of what we can see with bicycle crashes. So between that same 10-year period, we have a little bit more than 9,000 crashes with people on bicycles and motor vehicles that were reported. And the majority of those crashes, just like we saw in pedestrian crashes, are in urban areas. But the overall trend is a little bit more mixed. It has a little bit more up and down to the trend. So, you know, are we doing better? Are we doing worse? You know, it may be that we need to have different ways to measure than just straight numbers to really know whether safety is improving or not. Unfortunately, we don't have that exposure data, like I mentioned, to be able to look at crash rates, which might help us to see, you know, is the number of bicyclists increasing, and maybe that can help explain why the numbers are going up or down. So unfortunately, though, when we look at the fatal and severe injuries, those bicycle crashes are trending in the wrong direction. When we look at the first 5-year period compared to the second 5-year period. So again, when we look at the graph before showing the total numbers, we look at that rural, see it's roughly flat. And then when we go over here and we look at fatal rurals, you can see that actually in the first year period versus the second year 5-year period, those trends are going up. We see more severe and fatal outcomes happening in bicycle crashes in rural areas. And that also could make sense when we think about rural areas potentially having higher speed, 2-lane undivided roads, probably less bicycling infrastructure in those locations, maybe less roadway lighting. So there could be some other factors that go along with, you know, urban versus rural locations to think about. So last month, Stephen talked about roadway design a lot, and he talked about the relationship of speed to crash severity. So here's a different way of looking at that with this graph that shows the total number of crashes that are grouped by the posted speed. So you see those at the bottom. And for the road that the crash occurred on. So the majority, actually 67% of the bicycle motor vehicle crashes occurred on roads where the speeds had limits of 35 miles per hour or less. So most of the crashes are happening in lower speed roads, but the blue trend line, the line, not the bars, but the line, that shows the fatalities. And it's looking at and suspected serious injuries. And that shows that the trend of those types of crashes is happening on the higher speed roadways, where you are going to have more severe outcomes, again, because that crash energy with the higher speed motor vehicle driver. So that's something to think about. You know, more bicyclists might be bicycling on a lower speed road. But bicyclists that are bicycling on a higher speed road, if they're in a crash, it's going to be a more severe outcome. We can also look at trends for when crashes are more likely to occur. This example shows crashes by time of day and day of week, but we can also look at by time of year or seasonality. So 74% of the crashes do happen during daylight hours. This is for bicycle crashes specifically. But you can see there's a variance. There's a peaking that happens similar to what we see with motor vehicles. And but crash trends can also fluctuate by that seasonality. So, you know, when we think about when the weather is good, you might have more people out. When we think about the fall, where we have daylight saving happen, and you might have more crashes that are happening under dark conditions. So there can be some variability to think about with your crash data and light conditions in particular. All right, so once the data is pulled in, NCDOT does this with the PBCAT. They can actually report on crash types, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, how that process works. But the analysis of those kinds of data can give information on where the crashes occur, when they occur, and to whom they occur, based on the crash data. But what the data isn't going to directly tell you is the sequence of events that led to the crash between the pedestrian or bicyclist and the motorist. And so that's where the crash typing comes in. So historically, HSRC has used this system to identify and code each crash based on that sequence of events and the precipitating actions that led to the crash. So the way they do this is they review the crash report itself. They look at the narrative, they look at the diagrams, and the way things are coded, and the position and the direction of the bicyclist and the pedestrian and everything. And they're able to crash type the crash and also geocode the location. So here's two examples, images showing the motorist overtaking bicyclist crash type, which is actually the most common type of bicyclist crash. The top image is showing a motorist that's failing to detect the bicyclist in time to avoid or safely pass. And it's representing it in a nighttime condition, and it's on a curve. And so both of those other aspects, the nighttime and the curve, might be contributing factors for obscuring the motorist view. The bottom image shows a different variation of that motorist overtaking bicyclist that could be resulting from the motorist misjudging the space that's needed to safely pass. So you probably recall this if you've been to some of our earlier presentations. This is just a reminder that in the Watch For Me program, the messaging on the materials that we provide is focused on these crash types. And so a lot of what we do for implementation is structured around how to mitigate these most common crash types that we see from the statewide data that result in the most severe injuries based on that analysis. The one thing to point out is that when we think about what are the most severe pedestrian crash types, these are the top 4. And it's interesting that a good number of the crashes, I think it's about a third of them, actually do occur off of the roadway. So not necessarily something that your planner or engineer can address, but that really becomes more of maybe an ordinance or parking design type situation. Thinking about parking lots and driveways, that's where a lot of the crashes happen for pedestrians. But we'll focus on the groups of crashes that occur in the roadway system, because 19% of those resulted in fatal or suspected injury. So one of the most prevalent of that crash group for all severities is crossing the roadway, vehicle not turning. So what that means is that pedestrians are crossing the road, and they're struck by a motor vehicle that's basically just driving through, right? And that is a really highly represented for fatal and suspected serious injuries, which makes sense. It's where the motorist is probably going at a high rate of speed. And so 29% of the severe pedestrian crashes are in that group. Another crash type that's overrepresented are the walking along the roadway or pedestrian in the roadway. That can also include people who are standing in the roadway or lying in the roadway, and then people who are crossing an expressway. Those are where the severe crashes, the crash types happen. When we think about severe bicycle crash types, 8% of all bicycle crashes are resulting in a fatal or serious injury. And as I mentioned earlier, the motorist overtaking bicyclist is the more prevalent crash type here. It's really overrepresented. 42% of all crashes resulting in a fatal or serious injury are because of these motorist overtaking crashes. They're 5 times as high as the next prevalent group. So some of those other crash types that are overrepresented are the bicyclist failing to yield mid-block. So think about an example where a bicyclist maybe just rides out of a driveway without yielding to the oncoming motorist, or a bicyclist left turn merge. That's when maybe the bicyclist was struck, most likely struck from behind as they were trying to make a left turn, or then loss of control, turning error, head on, bicyclist right turn merge. There's several others that are also overrepresented in the crash, severe crashes, but those are the most common ones. So when we think about the crashes and the crash types, there can be some variability in what's the most common crash type in your community. So it's helpful to think about and understand those crash types, and how they might apply to general types of communities. So for example, in small towns and rural areas, we definitely see the motorist overtaking bicyclists. That's by far the most common crash type and the most severe. But when we look at beach towns or college communities, the crashes that take place more often at intersections and access points are the more prevalent ones. We can also look at pedestrian crashes by community type to think about the patterns there. So rural or small populations, or communities with small populations, are more likely to see the pedestrians being hit when walking along or in the roadway. Again, that might make sense. Rural locations may be less likely to have infrastructure like sidewalk. They might have poor lighting conditions. They may be along streets that have higher speeds. Mid-sized communities more often have motorists hitting pedestrians when backing or parking vehicles. So think about those parking lot type crashes. And again, remember, a good proportion of crashes, maybe not the most severe, but crashes do happen in parking lots. So that might be your problem. In beach towns, we see an overrepresentation in the dark dash crash. And again, that also might make sense when we think about, beach amenity, whatever it is, on one side of the road, and housing, hotels, restaurants, whatever it is on the other side of the road, that people may be attempting to cross outside of a crosswalk and they're not yielding to motorists. Okay, so we're almost at an hour here. I'm going to go ahead and we'll take a break. I'm going to look at the chat to see if we've got any questions coming in. And let's see. Oh, thanks, Troy, for sharing the crash map. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section. Does anybody else have any questions about anything that we just went over before we take a break? And feel free to take yourself off mute and to turn your camera on. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come in. So why don't we go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We will start back, let's start back at 11:05. And if you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll look at that before we start back. 11:05. Okay. I have that it's 11:05. Hopefully everybody had a good break. I don't see anything else added to the chat. But let me know if anybody else has any questions. And if not, we'll just resume then. All right, so we're going to back up a second and talk about the life cycle of a crash report. We've given you a taste for kind of what you can learn through the existing crash data that's out there. So let's think about how those data are collected and the step through the process for how the data are processed. So when a crash occurs, police are called. And the crash has to meet a certain level of criteria for reporting. And then once they meet that criteria, the crash is collected by the officer that's on the scene, and that is collected through this DMV 349 report form. And then we'll talk about the next steps for that. So I mentioned that there's certain criteria that it has to meet. So you can't submit this type of report if the crash doesn't involve a motor vehicle. So pedestrian or bicyclist crashes, they have to either result in a fatality, in a non-fatal personal injury, or property damage of $1,000 or more. The crash has to be in the traffic way or on the traffic way. And DMV actually defines that as any land way that's open to the public as a matter of right or custom for moving persons or property from one place to another. So it can't happen if you're, driving around in your neighbor's field, that kind of thing. So there's a certain threshold. And once that form is complete, the law enforcement agencies submit them to the DMV. And then the DMV historically has shared the bicycle and pedestrian motor vehicle crashes, those reports with HSRC, and then HSRC has crash typed and geocoded them. My understanding is that process is getting tweaked, and that I think NCDOT may be starting to do this in-house. So HSRC may no longer be involved in the crash typing. And I'm not even sure if the data is going to continue to be added to the PBCAT website. And that process does typically lag because you have to get the DMV data. It has to be crash typed and then put back up. But what NCDOT is maintaining for sure is the an ArcGIS map that they have. And all those crashes that are geocoded get spatially represented on these maps, and you can drill down into specific crashes. Each of those little dots or circles is an individual crash, and you can pull up crash report attributes for that particular crash, which can be helpful to see spatially. It doesn't include of course, the personal identifying information. So that crash map is available online as well, if you'd like to just drill in and kind of see spatially where your pedestrian crashes are, where your bicycle crashes are, and that kind of thing. So the other thing that happens with the crash report, of course, once you've got all that data in whatever database you're going to use, you can then analyze that data. And think about how you want to use those data, what story you're trying to understand from it, and what you can pull out. So here's an example in Durham where the data were used to create a heat map of where the highest density of the bicycle crashes are located. And it's overlaid with the individual locations. The individual green circles are the individual crashes. And then there's a heat map where you can see the density of crashes increases more in kind of the urban downtown area, kind of in the middle of the county. And then there's fewer crashes and there are darker colors for the buffering around those crashes as you go further out. So what crash variables are included? What kinds of data can you slice and dice if you're trying to do any kind of analysis? There's a lot. Here's just a pretty broad sampling, but I think there's even more data than this. And each one of these individual variables is important for understanding the crash trends and patterns. Not all of these variables are going to be relevant to every crash. And so that's why, again, it's really important for officers when they're collecting these to collect as many data points as possible that are relevant for each individual crash, because that individual data point is what gets combined with other data points to tell that larger story. So crash reports are the primary source of these crash data, of these details. And some of them come from the narrative, some of them come from the fillable information, that the codes that are put into the forms or the check boxes. And all of those details are important, not only so that that specific crash can be understood and acted on appropriately, but also because that collectively contributes to the understanding of bicyclist and pedestrian safety when we're using these data to analyze what's happening in this area and what should we be targeting, or where should we be targeting the efforts for mitigating these crashes. So some folks might choose to report crashes that don't meet those criteria, the state's criteria for what is a reportable crash. And I'm curious for anybody who's on the call today, you know, what do you do if a crash doesn't meet one of those criteria? Do you have a way of processing them or handling them that's maybe not through the DMV 349 form? And feel free to unmute yourselves if you've got if you know how your community might handle those types of crashes.
Hi, yes, I'm John Shaben from the Charlotte Department of Transportation, and we've had several pedestrian versus train crashes that I've had to go in and through our GIS system and code them individually, like I would get from the 349. I would have to recreate one in our crash software.
Yeah, and those are unique because they're trespassing, right? They're pedestrians who are trespassing. So it doesn't, the laws that apply don't fall under the motor vehicle code. Brian, do you have any additional insight you want to share?
I do, Sarah, and yeah. I appreciate you but I want to let you know that DMV 349 won't allow us to do it. Even if we did it, it would be against their rules, and it should be and it should be revoked from the DMV if you accidentally did one. So we also have an incident report that we do, and I think most departments do an incident report. Same information, just in a different form, and it doesn't go on of course with the DMV 349 stats.
Any other agencies have an example of a type of crash or a way that you can handle keeping track of these maybe that don't fit into that category?
Hey, Scott Elliott here from Burlington. Kind of what Brian said, we have the CAD, computer aided dispatch, and if it does not meet the criteria, officers just input the information for a simple, I backed into you, very minor damage, no injuries. They just exchange information, and we print that information off and give that something tangible for them to hold on to. They have the insurance information, and then we input that, document all that in our CAD system in case someone comes back has a discrepancy. We can go back and say, on this date and this time, this is what happened. And you do not have a physical 349, but there is documentation of the incident.
Okay, yeah, so that's great. So these could be other sources of data that, you know, folks might want to, again, when you're thinking about doing analysis or trying to understand your crash trends, you know, recognize that you may have these other incidents that are captured in some other database that you'd want to also look at. Now, my understanding is that the DMV 349 form does have a box towards the top that you can check that says it's a non-reportable report. And I don't know, Brian, were you saying that basically if a agency checks that box on a particular report, the data could still be submitted to DMV, but maybe they just don't do anything with it?
No, I think that box, non-reportable, we use it if it doesn't reach the amount criteria, or if somebody was to hit another car and we get there and we see no damage, but they just demand to have a crash report done, you know, we'll do that and make it non-reportable. We would, let's just say, for instance, that they had a crash with a excavator on a construction site, we wouldn't do one there because I don't think the non-reportable is meant for that kind of area, but we would still do a report, an incident report, but our non-reportable is used only when the value is not reached.
Mhm. Yeah, I have an example of one of my colleagues a few years ago bicycling in Raleigh, and she was bicycling in a bike lane next to parked cars, cars that were parallel parked next to the curb, and she wound up running into the back of one of the parked cars. So it was like this fluky kind of incident. But again, the car that she ran into was parked. It was not moving. It was not in transport. And so my understanding is that's another example where, even though she was injured, she couldn't do a crash report for it.
That's exactly correct, Sarah. I've had some near fatals where that exact incident, but and we would still get all the information we need. It just wouldn't fall under DMV 349.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, y'all. So we talked about, we can already be at a disadvantage of understanding the full scope of impacts for bicycle and pedestrian safety because some crashes just don't meet that criteria for reporting. But we also know that a lot of crashes that even do meet that criteria are not reported. And so we need to keep that in mind. Of the crashes that are reported, many are not able to use that form, many are not able to be crash typed because there's insufficient information that's logged onto the 349 form. So again, thinking back to, understanding the series of events, if there's not enough data in there, then we can't crash type those. And so there's about 22% of the pedestrian crashes and about 12% of those bicycle crashes that we just can't crash type because there's insufficient information. So one thing I want to really stress to the officers that are on the call today is really make sure you take that time up front when you're gathering the information for the report. Really think through what it is that you're filling out and the details. The details really matter for these. So let's go through some examples of that. So one thing to point out is, pedestrians and bicyclists are not required to have a license or even an ID when you're walking around. For me, example, when I'm walking around in my neighborhood, I'm carrying my phone, but I'm usually not carrying anything else. And so, being able to get that personal information could be problematic. You want to make sure that you know the relevant laws that are applicable. If you're not familiar with the bicycle and pedestrian laws, I do encourage you to look at Module 2. This should say Module 2, I believe. Is it Module 2? Last year we did a repeat of Module 2 and 3 are the same, but the laws module. And I want to stress that, don't dismiss the bicycle and pedestrian crashes as being less than or treat them differently than you would maybe a motor vehicle crash. You want to find witnesses. If there's witnesses, if somebody's injured, you may need to follow up or go to the hospital. It's really important not to breeze through the conditions of the roadway or the weather or visual obstructions, things like that. You really need to think about it from the bicyclist or the pedestrian's perspective as well, because some things that you maybe would discount or not really think was a factor for a motor vehicle crash really could have been for a bicycle or pedestrian crash. So you need to also be really specific in your narrative and with the diagrams that you provide. So some things to think about when you're reporting a pedestrian crash. There might be some other details, again, that you don't usually capture for a motor vehicle crash. So thinking about, was the pedestrian using headphones, wearing headphones? What kind of clothing were they wearing? Do they have glasses? Were they, were they wearing some sort of glasses? I already talked about don't just putting at for the intersection if the crash was literally not at the intersection. So you need to be specific with respect to the location of the crash to any marked or unmarked crosswalks that might be around, and with respect to the intersection itself. For pedestrians, some things that you might want to think about is that lane position. Where was the bicyclist traveling with respect to the motor vehicle? Did the motor vehicle actually, did the motorist give space to pass? Thinking about the condition of the bicycle itself, thinking about the safety equipment that's associated with that bicycle. Did that bicycle, was it equipped with headlights, reflectors, tail lights, things like that? What type of bicycle is it? Other things like that can help to explain either the sequence of events or explain something that could be a contributing factor. And then, of course, was the bicyclist wearing a helmet or not? Now, remember, people who are over 16 are not required to wear a helmet. And so, but you can, if there is a helmet, you can look at whether it was damaged potentially. So those are all things to keep in mind that you wouldn't obviously collect if it was a motor vehicle crash. When we talk about some of the external or environmental factors, really need to be paying attention to what is the infrastructure like in that location? What was the weather like? Is there a construction zone, a temporary traffic pattern that's changed? Anything like that could influence where a bicyclist is riding or where a pedestrian is walking. So one example of that, getting back to one that we showed at a prior training, this pothole might not phase a motorist at all, but for a bicyclist, there's a couple things that could happen with this pothole. It could be that the bicyclist goes over this pothole and that causes them to crash and lose control of the bicycle. Or it could be that they change their lane position to move around and avoid that pothole, and maybe the driver wasn't anticipating that. So that's why it's really important to think about the roadway condition, the surface condition, and trying to capture some of those specific details. What do the witnesses or the people involved in the crash say? Did the motorist say that the bicyclist veered suddenly? Maybe there's a reason for that. Just kind of thinking through some perspectives that maybe you wouldn't be thinking about for a traditional motor vehicle crash. Again, with that built environment, things that can influence where a bicyclist or pedestrian is traveling or what their behavior is, again, are things that could be contributing to the crash. So, are there sidewalks present? Was there a bike facility present? Were people using either of those facilities, or were they in the roadway? If a pedestrian is on the roadway, kind of clarifying, are they literally in the travel lane? Are they on the shoulder? Those kinds of information can be really important. And then if you see maintenance issues, like in this example here, there's a sidewalk, but it's pretty poorly maintained, particularly for people who maybe have disabilities, they might not really even be able to use this sidewalk, depending on what the condition is. So all of those things can again be contributing to a crash. So that is a lot that we went through. I wanted to reiterate this this pedestrian and bicycle crash resource for you with the PB CAT. It does have data currently through 2019. As I mentioned, I'm not sure if NCDOT is going to continue to put crash data into the query tool here, but the summary reports are still very relevant. And I encourage you to look at that information while you can. And then the link to the, there's also a link to the crash data. And if you want training on how to use the TEAS data, I think that's also available through NCDOT. So if you want access to the statewide database, we can drop a link in the chat to that, to the TEAS crash data system. Kristen already provided the website where you can spatially see your crashes. And then there's finally one other resource that I want to call out that can be really useful to think about motor vehicle crash injuries. And it's through the Carolina Center for Health Informatics. They've got a website that they developed for several different data sources around motor vehicle crash injury and research related to that. So that is another one. Hopefully Kristen can drop in the chat. So I know I went through that last section pretty quickly. I wanna just pause for a moment. We've got plenty of time. If people have questions, if you have specific questions about reporting or about crash data in your area, how to access it, how to use it, maybe problems that you're coming up with. We can even talk about countermeasures for if you know about certain crash trends in your area and you just want to brainstorm a bit about ways to mitigate. We can use the rest of this time for any questions that you guys might have. So I'm actually gonna, let's see. Let me just go through a couple more slides and then I'm going to turn it back to the larger screen where we can see everybody. So as I mentioned, Kristen is going to share the recording today. When that gets posted, she'll send out an email to everybody who registered so that you can share it with others. It will also have the information about how to do the evaluation. We really appreciate feedback on the trainings that we do. It helps inform how we can improve, or if you have any, positive or negative feedback, we'll take it all because it helps us to make better training for y'all in the future. So be sure to be on the lookout for that email from Kristen. Definitely feel free to forward information about the recordings to others who you think might benefit from them. And then specifically for our Watch For Me folks, I want to reiterate, we've got this Google group that you can reach out to at any time if you have a question of, hey, we're dealing with XYZ issues in our area. Has anybody else encountered that? And how did you deal with it? Those kinds of things. Feel free to use the Watch For Me listserv to do that. We've also got the partner resources page, which is really useful for folks to go back and look at. And then Kristen's and my contact information is there. Hopefully you have that, but we can also put that in the chat. And then I think we had Brian's maybe earlier. Brian, if you want to put your contact info in the chat too, that'd be great. And then just a reminder about the upcoming workshop next month, which Kristen will also remind you about in email. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so we can maybe all see each other better. If you want to turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves, we'll just open it up for discussion or questions that folks might have. And Brian, if there's anything in particular you feel like I didn't spend enough time on and you want to expound a little more, feel free.
I really appreciate what you did, and I think you went over a lot of stuff. I will tell you, and we've talked about a bunch. Reporting is something that in the academy we get a week's worth of reporting, but only 10 or 15 minutes worth of pedestrian and bicycle reporting. So it's not that we haven't seen it, we just don't see it very often, and a lot of times blocks will get confusing, and we don't know what to put here and there. With the, a lot of people are on tracks or eCrash, a few people left on paper, but it's getting that, it all asks the same questions. It's just getting the right information and putting it in there. One thing that we see, not particular bicycle pedestrian, but in general is people not putting at or putting at a location when they really don't mean that it happened at an intersection. It happened down the road a little while, 100 feet, 200 feet, whatever it might be. So we found that a lot, that officers, it's easier to click the at button than to fill out all the rest of the information. So that's one thing that we've seen cause a little bit of problems. And to me, it really took me going out to some of these intersections and seeing, like, some of the engineers, they get this information from our crash report, and the intersection turned out, it looked bad statistically, but in reality it wasn't for some reason. So that happens sometimes. But any other questions anybody has, please reach out to me.
I'm kind of curious for those of you who are on the call, how many of you have actually looked at the crash data for your communities, or are familiar at all with the crash data for your community? And you can either, okay, I see some folks putting stuff in the chat, or if you're able to do a reaction, you can thumbs up or something. Yep. A few folks. Has anybody actually used their crash data to help inform, maybe mitigation strategies, or where you might implement certain either enforcement events or actually like improving the infrastructure or anything like that? And maybe want to share an example?
Sarah, you don't have a lot of talkers today, but I'll run my mouth while they're thinking, and then maybe they'll chime in. I want to say that T's, I've been in the police department 22 years. At first part of my career, I never reached out to anybody to get any traffic information or get any crash information. But I found out later on, I'm on a traffic team now, and we really try to narrow down and make particular areas safer. And we don't have a lot of time. I know a lot of departments don't have a lot of time. So we try to do enforcement now and more quality areas that are having problems, so that we're not wasting a lot of time. So I hope that helps. Tease, it is, if you guys have never used it, it's not something you can just sign on and pick up. It does take a lot of training, but there are a lot of people you can reach out to that are familiar with Tease that can get you that information.
Yeah, and I don't know how many of y'all are aware of the North Carolina Traffic Safety Conference that's coming up next week in Raleigh. But there are going to be several sessions that are talking around crash data, particularly bicycle and pedestrian crash data, but also the injury and health prevention side of it and the hospital records. So if that's something else that you're interested in learning more about, and you're able to go to that conference next week, I think that could be really helpful. Teresa, I see your hand is raised. Yeah, feel free to come off mute if you're able.
Well, I just didn't want you to think that we're not listening. So you asked something about, have you looked at this data before? I'm community development, so in a planning role and an analyst role historically, and I have looked at the data. And usually I have to depend on other departments like engineering to kind of provide me the analytics of it. So I just wanted to let you know that this session has been very helpful. I've been through the break, I went and looked at some of the links that you provided, and I'll be able to grab things. And some of the things before you had presented, I didn't even know were really out there, because I just been pinpointing down, I need this, can you provide that? So I think it's going to be very helpful in those
Great.
areas and developing pedestrian facilities. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad that you're finding some use in this. Troy, I see your camera's on.
Hey, good morning. This is Troy Wilson. I'm with NCDOT. I see that Rose Bogus is on here with the Southwestern RPO. We actually use some of the crash mapping, the fatalities and injuries to help us when we plan projects. We use those maps to look at areas we have specifically in Clay and Macon County, US 19, US 129. We've had some fatalities and some injuries, some serious injuries out there. So we use this reporting and these different things, bike, ped, even vehicle crashes to help us hone in on areas that are needing to be improved. And it helps us to focus in on these areas and take a hard look at what we may need to do to improve these areas to make them safer. So we do, especially with DOT, we reference this stuff. The key for us is reporting. I mean, the more that is reported accurately, the easier the data is to use. Like you said, when it may show an intersection that's really bad, but when you actually pull the report, well, it's 200 feet down the road or 300 foot on the side road or is in the parking lot. It just causes more work and additional things like that, which the data is good to have. We can dig through that, but if it is recorded accurately, it really helps in the planning and as far as that goes.
Yeah, thank you for giving those examples. Troy, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I'm not sure that you're necessarily going to be able to answer this, but do you know what NCDOT is doing with the bike ped PBCAT tool specifically, or are they going to continue to do the crash typing?
I'm not sure. That's not my specific unit, so I don't know.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm curious myself to learn more about that. This is a relatively recent transition, so yeah. Keith?
Sorry, I had to step away. I'm not sure where we're at.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I saw your camera come on, so I thought maybe you just wanted to contribute or had a question. We're just in general discussion mode right now for anything, any topic related to bike ped safety you want to bring up or ask a question about or share a comment on.
Well, the only comment I have is thank you for sharing the link to the statewide crash data map. I was just poking around in there, and I mean we use Numetric. I say I'm no longer with Charlotte Transportation. I'm with Charlotte Area Transit now, but that's been a really useful tool for us in terms of tracking crash data. But it's specific just to the city of Charlotte geography. So being able to kind of compare and look at that data statewide is very helpful. So thanks again for sharing the link to that map.
Sure, no problem. When you said you're now with CATS, do you have particular ways that you look at safety for pedestrians or bicyclists that might be engaging or interacting with the bus system?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like yet. I'm just in the first month in my new position as a bus stop planner. I know we're looking at integrating ride share and micromobility, bike share, scooter share into our future mobility hubs, and we're kicking that off as a pilot project in October. So with my bike ped safety background, I am looking at how to work with Charlotte with transportation in terms of kind of the safe routes to transit approach. Our department isn't responsible for right-of-way improvements, but we do work closely with CDOT, of course, in terms of where can we put crosswalks to benefit bus stop pairs so people are able to get safely to and from their destinations, et cetera. So I'm not exactly sure. Well, I could see like using this crash data to as kind of a an overlay to our bus stops and our micromobility zones, and looking at, okay, where are there like high ped bike crashes in proximity within our mobility hub areas, and using that maybe as a metric to prioritize different treatments within those areas.
Yeah, and I mean, my understanding is that a lot of transit agencies have actually pretty good data for boarding and alighting, you know, people who are literally getting on or off at a particular bus stop, those numbers. So that could be pretty interesting too, because you might be able to do something specific with a crash rate relative to the bus stops themselves based on those counts, to understand maybe where particular bus stops have a higher crash rate or something like that.
Yeah,
That
that's
could be kind
a
of
good
interesting.
point. Mhm.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing.
You bet.
Anybody else have any thoughts, questions, concerns? I know Keith mentioned the micromobility aspects. You know, some communities have bike share or scooter share, or maybe you're seeing more unique modes happening in your communities. And that's something that the DMV 349 form attempts to address, but that's another example where, you know, it depending on the mode of conveyance that the person is using, it may not fit neatly into the bicycle or the pedestrian categories that are given. So that's another example where I think, you know, people are talking about how can the form be improved? How can we collect some of these newer modes of micromobility to understand, you know, how many crashes are actually e-scooter crashes or something like that. So having that kind of detail in the narrative is also something that's helpful. And researchers for sure are looking at that information and looking at ways to potentially improve the reporting process. Okay, well, if no one else has any other questions or you know, stories to contribute, then I think we'll go ahead and wrap up early today. I'll give you about 15 minutes of your time back to your morning. That's always a good thing, right before lunch. We appreciate you all joining us on the webinar today, and we look forward to seeing you on September 14th to talk about and learn more about communications around pedestrian and bicycle safety. So until then, everybody stay safe and see you soon.